Mr. Speaker, when Canadians are asked about the greatest threat facing Canada today, they list one concern above all others: the climate change crisis. Climate change is seen by Canadians as a far greater threat to their future well-being than problems with the healthcare system, terrorism, crime, or the war in Afghanistan. With climate change, we face an unprecedented planetary crisis. Last week, the Nobel Peace Prize for 2007 was awarded to Al Gore and the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The world has understood the gravity of this crisis. Does this government? As a historian, I can only find one parallel in our history where human activity has threatened the very future existence of the Earth itself, and that is all-out nuclear war. But the difference between nuclear war and the climate change crisis is also great. In one case, nuclear war, it would be the actions of a few states and a few world leaders that would produce an instant, irreversible catastrophe. The climate change crisis, however, has been building over decades of industrial activity in the developed countries like Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Japan. All of us in the developed world are implicated as consumers, as users of energy, as people whose advanced living standards have depended on burning the fossil fuel which produces the CO2 which contributes to climate change. As politicians with limited time horizons, facing, in our case, the possibility of elections at any time, it is hard to imagine a crisis which demands a global solution, a global effort requiring constant, dedicated work over decades and generations, country by country, industry by industry, citizen by citizen. Yet that is our challenge. History will judge our generation of politicians severely if, knowing what we know today about the causes and effects of climate change, we fail to act decisively in our time in the face of this great threat to the planet's very survival. So how does this speech from the throne respond to this mighty challenge? Given the minimal references to climate change in the first speech from the throne, there has been something of a deathbed conversion in the latest effort. There is a grudging recognition of the reality of climate change, but no sense of urgency. Indeed, no real conviction. Who, after all, wrote the words in the speech from the throne? A Prime Minister who called the United Nations action on climate change a socialist money-sucking scheme. A Prime Minister who only last December referred to so-called greenhouse gases as if calling the science itself into question. A Prime Minister who said that ordinary Canadians from coast to coast will not put up with what Kyoto will do to their economy and lifestyle when the benefits are negligible. When the benefits are negligible, we're talking about the survival of the planet, and the benefits are negligible? And what have they done as a government, Mr. Speaker? Next to nothing. In fact, worse than nothing. We're now traveling in reverse. The Conservative government is trying to use its own failure to meet Kyoto targets as a political wedge. Canada will likely not meet Kyoto targets because Mr. Harper scrapped all climate change programs upon coming into office, then implemented weak substitutes that ignore our obligations. The Conservatives have admitted that their so-called plan will result in absolutely no reductions in Canada's total greenhouse gas pollution during the first phase of Kyoto, and will not even be in place before 2010. According to the C.D. Howe Institute, the Deutsche Bank, the Pembina Institute, and the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, the Conservatives will not meet their own far too modest targets and will allow this country's carbon emissions to increase until 2050 and beyond. Last month, even the government's own advisory board, the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy, expressed serious doubts as to the likelihood of any of the government's own targets being met. Under two consecutive Conservative environment ministers, there has been no attempt to move forward seriously, and not even an honest and full effort to curb greenhouse gas pollution. In fact, one of the Prime Minister's first acts in office was to scrap the previous government's plan, spend a year doing nothing, then arbitrarily reintroduce pieces of it to feign their commitment, but with far less funding, less vigor, no coherence, and altogether incompetent implementation. Consider the cockamamie auto rebate scheme, which has infuriated altogether manufacturers, auto workers, and consumers who have yet to receive a penny. The government's plan has no hope of meeting its own overly modest targets. It's nothing more than a wolf in sheep's clothing, and if we are to believe Tom Flanagan, so was the Prime Minister. The government fails to understand that we need to do everything we can do to reduce greenhouse gases while strengthening our economy. Instead of action and leadership, we have inaction and denial. In many ways, Canada does serve as a guide to other nations, much like the North Star invoked in yesterday's throne speech. But the Prime Minister needs to open his eyes the next time he visits our far north and understand the scope of devastation from climate change facing entire communities and indeed an entire way of life. The Prime Minister cannot choose to defend our northern sovereignty without also fighting climate change in a way that protects the very people who live there. The speech from the throne made a curious claim also about Canada's role on the international stage, Mr. Speaker. Canada is back. When it comes to Canada's leadership role in the world on climate change, we're back all right, way back. Back out of the pack, back out the door, down the street, out of town, and hiding in the bush. What Canada needs to do is treat the climate change crisis as seriously as we did the threat of fascism in the 1930s. Our leader has been described as obsessed and single-minded on the subject of climate change. That's right. Winston Churchill was described as obsessed and single-minded in his day. That's the leadership we need. As in 1939, we need a total mobilization of our society and economy with a single purpose of winning the war against climate change. This means putting a price on carbon emissions. This means examining every aspect of our economy and society, from large heavy industry to fossil-fueled electrical generation to upstream oil and gas, to all aspects of transportation, to all our buildings, from housing to commercial, and all the energy-consuming appliances and heating and cooling machinery inside our buildings, to agriculture, forestry, and the management of urban waste. We need a tremendous national effort to reorient our economy and society to the 21st century, so we get energy, the environment, and the economy, the three E's, pulling in the right direction. As with World War II, Canada faces a crisis and an opportunity. Let us ignore the naysayers, the minimalists, and those who have passed from denial to despair without an intervening period of hope. Let us mobilize ourselves and dedicate ourselves as Canadians in responding to the greatest challenge of our generation, the climate change crisis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.